The views, information, or opinions expressed during the Cult for the Culture podcast are solely those of the individuals involved. The content presented is not a substitute for seeking or seeing a licensed mental health professional.
Know what's up next, know what's up next. Healthy pleasure with it, coping for the culture. Better tune in. Big sis, get 'em, big sis, get 'em. Coping for the culture, coping for the culture. Coping for the culture, coping for the culture. Coping for the culture, coping for the culture. Coping for the culture, cope.
Hey, y'all, and welcome to the Cult for the Culture podcast. I am your host, Tiana Renee. On this show, we interview individuals from different walks of life who are dedicated to being the change within the culture as it relates to various topics and their effects on the world of mental health. Today's show is about mental health and addiction, and it will be a solo episode, so it's just me and y'all today. But before I even get into the topic, I really want to talk to you guys today about another self-care tip, one that I personally have been trying to work on myself. And I know it's something that's difficult for a lot of people, and it sounds so simple, but it's not. I know a lot of people who struggle with this concept. Like I said, I was victim, and although I'm working on it, I still fall short sometimes. But that self-care tip for today, y'all, is just to say no. Just say no. That's it. Just say no. I know we feel like we have an obligation sometimes to all people, all things. And in the midst of all of those things, the only thing that gets put on the back burner is ourselves. And then we're trying to serve and help and work and do all of our daily lives, activities, care for other people. Some of us have children, some of us have spouses, all of these different things. And we get so used to saying yes that it becomes like a foreign thing to say no. I know for me, I struggled for a long time with saying no. And I struggled because I would just have so much anxiety about what that other person would say, how they would feel. I had this big fear of disappointing people. I never wanted anybody to be mad with me or upset or feel like I didn't care because I didn't want to be a part. And it was a struggle for you, girl. It was really a struggle. And to be honest, sometimes I do still struggle with that. And I have to check myself and say, okay, Tiana, if you agree to go do this, then when are you going to have time for yourself? And at this point in my journey and in my self-awareness, I know when I don't have time for myself, I start to lose it. And when I say lose it, I mean, I'm more agitated. It's harder for me to get along with people. I'm more offended by the smallest things. I just feel so lethargic. It's so many things that happen. And so I say all that to say, you cannot operate from a cup that is half full. You cannot pour into everybody else and not pour into yourself. It's just unrealistic and it's not right. And you deserve the best attention from yourself than you give to anybody else. You deserve to take care of you. You deserve to feel whole. You deserve to feel like you're in a place where you can function, where you can operate on a daily basis, where you're able to fulfill your duties as a person and whatever other roles that you have within life. But really just take the time to start trying it out and saying no. You don't have to say no to everything. Start small. Figure out what works for you, what doesn't work. Think about the feelings that you have when you say no. Think about how you take on the responsibilities and the emotions and the needs of everyone else and how that makes you feel. Consider all these things. And if at the end of the day, it doesn't feel good, at the end of the day, if you feel like, man, I just really need time to myself, just say, okay, no, thank you for inviting me, but no, I can't make it. Thank you for thinking of me, but no, I don't have the capacity to do that today. All of these things, it's okay. Say no. Even plan out time. For weeks, actually for months, I was moving nonstop, like moving. I was everywhere. I was all things to all people. I was working, I was recording, I was doing all these different things. And I was just so tired, y'all. So I finally had a weekend where I was like, okay, this is the weekend where I'm not doing anything. And I went ahead and let my people know in advance. My circle of people, my tribe, the people who support me, I told them from the beginning, okay, this weekend is for Tiana. I need this weekend. I'm not doing anything else but just sitting in the house and relaxing and taking time to decompress and get back to myself. And it worked out and I needed it and it helped and I felt so much better. So if y'all don't get anything else, y'all get this. Say no and it's okay. And if someone gets upset, they'll be okay. And if you're worried about offending somebody, if they're really for you and they really care about you, they'll recognize and know that as your person, you need time. You need time, and that is okay. And it is not a crime to take time to yourself. You heard it here first. Say no. Just say no. Okay, so y'all heard me earlier when I said the topic for today was mental health and addiction. And I'm going to go ahead on the record and say before I get too deep into this, like I say always, for episodes that I know may be a little heavier, this may be a heavy episode. And you heard me before preach all about saying no. So if you feel like this episode is not for you and you're not in a place where you can listen today, that's okay. I won't hold anything against you. I'm glad that you're saying no. And if you need to listen to it at another time, then do that. Know yourself, know how you feel. Go ahead and do a body scan to see what's going on with you, what your experience was today, what emotions you're carrying. And if it's just too much, it's okay. Say no and keep going. But I always like to say that before because I need people to be able to make their own informed decisions when it relates to listening to the content of this podcast. Yes, it's helpful, but it's also helpful to know what does not work for you. And I'm okay with that. But addiction. So this episode is heavy for me, honestly. And I get up here and I talk about all these things and I really try, and I think I do a good job, but I know that there are some episodes that just touch me a little differently. And this is one of those episodes where it touches me differently. It really hits home, very, very close to home. And so if I struggle with this topic, which I don't anticipate I will, but I am human. So if at some point I struggle, y'all just bear with me and know that there's something coming out of this and that there will still be a message and we're still going to keep rocking and we're going to keep going. But it is very near to me. I'm very passionate about this topic. I know that addiction right now is something that we don't talk about as much. We have lived in a culture where we have normalized drug use and alcohol use. And if you go to a party, it's not uncommon for those things to be there. It's not uncommon for those things to happen. It's not uncommon to see those things. And, addiction didn't just start this year. It didn't just start last year. Addiction is something that we have been dealing with for a very long time in the Black and minority community and culture. It is something that has plagued us for a very long time, and it has caused so much trauma, so much stress to our culture, to our community. It has really just taken a toll. And if we want to be specific, because, I always like to make sure that I'm presenting knowledge and factual knowledge. And I will never just come up here talking out of the side of my neck about anything, because a lot of these topics are very serious. They are very serious. I have charged myself to be an advocate. I call myself the culture's advocate. And that's who I want to be. And if I want to be that person, then I have to recognize and understand that I have to come at this from a different angle. This isn't something to be played with. And it's not something that's funny. It's not something that feels good, but it's something that we need to acknowledge and recognize and get the conversation going, because the reality is our culture is suffering when it comes to addiction. We really are. And it didn't just start. Like I said, it didn't just start now. It started a long, 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 long time ago. A long, long time ago. And the thing that I'm referring to specifically is good old President Nixon. So we're all familiar with Nixon. We're all familiar with his era and some of the things that happened then. And some of us may not be, and that's okay if you don't. He wasn't a great person. I'll just go out there and say this. As far as it relates to our community and our culture, he was not a great person. And he had an agenda which he presented to the world as this great thing. But really, it was an agenda to take out our culture and take out our people and create the narrative that we now have as it relates to Black and minority cultures and addiction and drug use, and how they've criminalized it and made us these villains where we're just so wrong. And they treat addiction as if it is a crime versus treating it as a disease. And because they're treating it as a crime versus treating it as a disease, we're getting crime sentences. We're going to court. We're going to jail. We're getting all those things, but we're not getting treatment. We're not getting help. We're not addressing the issue. We're doing something else. And so Nixon decided that he was going to declare war on drugs. And there's this quote, y'all, and I have to read this verbatim because I need y'all to understand. But essentially what the war on drugs was that Nixon decided to basically put drugs into minority and Black communities and use that as an opportunity to press his agenda, which was really to get rid of us in some capacity. And so I want y'all to listen to this. So there was a person who worked in his camp, which was his aide by the name of John. And I cannot pronounce his last name. I think is Ehrlichman. That sounds right. But there is a statement from him. This is verbatim. Okay, so quotation marks, and I'm going to start. So you want to know what this was really about. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Y'all, okay, I'm just gonna stop there. Both for dramatic effect and also for y'all to take a minute to let that process and simmer in for those of you who have never heard this statement or never knew exactly what the war on drugs was. Nixon essentially created the opportunity for our people to be addicted to drugs. Not only just us, but we also heard the hippies too, and then criminalize it, up the charges for what was considered legal possession, up the numbers, for what was considered illegal possession, and then put harsh sentences on our people, and then put us into jail as a result to essentially clean the community and do what he felt like was necessary. How just mind-blowing is that one person felt, and his whole camp, that this was okay. Let's put drugs in their community and get them addicted. Like, wow. Like, that's all I can say to that is wow. How is that okay by any means? So that's essentially where it started. And then, of course, in 1972, the commission, decided to decriminalize the possession and distribution of marijuana for personal use. But of course, Nixon ignored that and rejected the recommendations. And then you have between 1973 and 1977, where 11 states decide to decriminalize marijuana possession, which was a start. So they started there, right? But within a few years, looking to where we are now, essentially, the tide has shifted and proposals to decriminalize marijuana were abandoned. So then you have the point in time where Clinton came into office and he tried to, change the narrative and tried to be more helpful, but essentially went on to the same thing. And just even to backtrack some, within the 1980s, where Miss Nancy Reagan decided that she wanted to do the anti-drug campaign and coined the slogan, just say no. So we have that time. Okay, flash forward. Then we have Clinton when he tried. But then eventually, within the 90s, he picked up and adopted the same thought process, which just continued the issue of addiction. So now here we are in a country where essentially we were victimized. You're thinking about communities back in that time. We're thinking the civil rights era. We're thinking Jim Crow laws and all the stress and poverty and all these things that were going on that we were trying to manage. Racism on a daily basis, we were trying to manage. And at that time, I'm going to go ahead and put it on the record that I don't think we knew what coping meant. Like, we tried to cope, but I don't think that we had a clear idea and clear understanding of the mind and the body and how it's all connected and what it means to take care of ourselves. I think at that point in time, we were on the train that we got to be strong. We got to keep pushing forward. We got to do what we got to do to make it. And sometimes doing what we got to do to make it meant that we self-medicated. And it has been a whirlwind ever since. I will never for the life of me understand why it was more appropriate to criminalize addiction than it was to seek help for addiction, and how we have passed on addiction from generation to generation. Because for those of you who don't know, addiction can be passed down from generation to generation. It becomes a part of your genetics and a part of your DNA. And so if you had a parent who struggled with addiction, you had a 50-50 chance essentially to either become an addict yourself or not. That's huge. That is so huge, y'all, to have that ratio, that percentage of hit or miss. So that's like thinking if you have, siblings, if it's two of y'all, it's essentially one of y'all will potentially be addicted to something. And that breaks my heart that we haven't gotten, or I won't say we haven't gotten, because I think, I'm flash forwarding now. Let's let's not talk about Nixon and Clinton and Reagan and that whole era. I'm not even going to get in the bush because we know what his whole his whole reign was and what that looked like. And, I think about when Obama was here and the pardons that he initiated and working on, not criminalizing drug use and working on pardoning people who have either been wrongly accused or were put into jail for those situations. But, addiction has become so normalized and it has become a huge part of our culture. And I know that we don't label it as addiction. And I know y'all keep hearing me say addiction, addiction, addiction. And I will keep saying it because addiction is real and addiction is a disease. And I think sometimes we fail to recognize that. At some point, yes, we make the decision to, use whatever drug of choice. But at a certain point, the choice is no longer yours when you become addicted to anything. It changes the biology of your brain. Your brain is essentially wired different when you become addicted to something. It becomes a need. It's no longer a want. It's what your body needs to function and to press through. And that's why when we consider, people who suffer from addiction, we try to rationalize why they're making these decisions. How dare you abandon your family or lose your job or sell your family's possessions and steal and engage in criminal activity. But the need becomes so strong that you essentially are willing to do whatever to fulfill that. And the decision process, like I said, is no longer yours. It's no longer yours. And I need, people while listening today to recognize and have a certain level of compassion to understand that addiction is a disease and it can be a very huge struggle. But I wanted to just talk about some of the things that we deal with when it comes to addiction. Like I said, I like to read y'all facts and I like to make sure that I'm giving factual information. But of course, when it comes to addiction, within America and within the United States, the issue is always a black and white, right? But it's also very heavy in the Native American community and Latino community. No one within any race, I want to put that out there, is exempt from addiction. Addiction it essentially can take anyone. It can be you, it can be a family member, it can be a friend. There are people probably right now within your circle and around you that have developed either an addiction or a dependency to certain things that you probably have no idea about. And I want y'all to keep that in consideration as you're listening today. But essentially, right now, one of the things that we are dealing a lot with is the opioid crisis and prescription painkillers that are just plaguing our culture and plaguing our community. And for those of you who don't know, the opioid crisis has recently been declared a national emergency. And when we think about opioids, we always think about, white suburbia, Caucasians, their culture, and what that looks like. And we associate it with them, but we don't necessarily look at it for us. But the thing is that between our community, so that's African American, Black, Latino populations, there has been a dramatic increase in the opioid deaths between 2015 and 2016. And even more since then, within 5 states, that the death rates are higher among minority populations than among the general population. So that's the United States as a whole. Within 5 states, it's heavier just within those 5 states than it is for the United States of America. That is a mind-blowing number. Then we also think about heroin overdose that has more than doubled among, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. But it's been very overlooked by the media. When we think of our culture and how the media portrays our culture, it's always marijuana, it's always weed. That's the thing that they associate with us. And so that's the thing that we've essentially been associated with outside of course, heroin within the war on drugs era. But this is where we go back to criminalizing it instead of making it more about treatment and rehabilitation. But African American drug users are 3 times more likely to be arrested for illegal drug use, which I'm sure we know. And so 2/3 of people incarcerated for drug-related offenses are people of color. So even if there is a white man or white woman that is engaging in drug dealing and pushing that market, they're less likely, which I'm sure these aren't facts that are these aren't facts that we're surprised about. I'll say that. These aren't facts that we probably haven't heard before. We know when it comes to criminalization, we're more likely to suffer than those of white America. We do know that. And that's not me being biased or me being funny. That's just the facts. That's just what we know. That's what we've learned. But when it comes to our population, drug addiction has been viewed as a problem primarily against racial minorities, especially Black people. And addiction has been around since the 20th century, y'all, but it has been so distorted, and the view and how we treat it has just been, I try not to use the word crazy, but I feel like in situations like this, I can say it's crazy that this is a thing. And so we are just really in a place where we have to make a decision as a community. And I realize that sometimes we feel like certain things are not afforded to us and we don't have the same opportunities. And although I agree with that, I think that if we increase our knowledge and increase our awareness of the things that are plaguing our community and the things that we are struggling with, I do believe that we can get to a point where we can start rehabilitating ourselves. And I don't mean that rehabilitating in the sense of running our own in-home rehab centers and helping people wean off drugs. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is calling addiction what addiction is, and that is addiction. It has become so popular and so mainstream within the culture to talk about drug use. It's all in songs. Like I said earlier, it's not an issue to either have seen drug use, to have been a part of drug use, to have seen it on TV, to have heard about it. It's not to see it growing up within your family, within your household. Those things are not uncommon. And then you think about, of course, when I say rap songs, I always think about Future. Future and Lil Wayne, actually, have to be two of the people that I know who are the most open about their drug use. And really what I hear when I hear those is a cry for help. Because I think for a long time, as I was saying earlier, we haven't known how to cope as a culture. And so sometimes coping means to self-medicate and to avoid and to not deal with the problem head on. And so if we can put ourselves in a situation where we're either drinking or smoking or whatever the case is, that we can push through and not have to deal with whatever the reality is of our situation. But the reality also is that a high is temporary. And when that high comes down, the problems don't go away. And so because those problems don't go away, we continue to use, and then addiction actually becomes a thing. And I know for me, I'm thinking about back when I was in college, we don't even consider like the amount of binge drinking we do in college. And that may not be everyone's experience, but I know it was an experience for a lot of people to go to a party and to pregame before the party, which for those of you who don't know what pregame means, it means to drink before the party, then go to the party to drink some more. And by the end of the night, you're completely out of your mind because we have no limit and we just keep pushing and we just keep going. And I know situations for me in college where it could have been very dangerous for me, for my health, for my life, for all these things, but it's so normalized and it's become a thing that's just a part of the party culture. And I think and I know actually that that's for all cultures. It's not just our culture, but I know that within our culture, we are good for throwing a good pregame, good for, fellowshipping and enjoying one another's company, accompanied with those things. And I know when we're doing the binge drinking and all of that, we don't consider the fact that at some point we can become dependent on these things. And I know for me, before I got to a point where I was more self-aware, where I was learning more how to manage my own mental health and what that looked like. And like I said, it was something that I had been exposed to and something that I was potentially at risk of becoming myself. But I didn't consider those things when I was engaging in certain behaviors and how that would have a long-term effect on me, and how it was nothing to drink an excessive amount of liquor and keep going. And if I had a long day, to want to have a drink or have several drinks or to go party, and not connecting the two. Like, you're not fixing the problem. You're only substituting it with something that can become a potentially even bigger problem. And I'm using my own example because I don't want anybody up here to feel judged for any reason. I do not want anybody to feel judged. We all have our own experiences and we all have things that allow us to go down a certain path in life. Sometimes that can be great. Sometimes it can be hard. Sometimes it can be everything in between. And I always just like to be transparent with myself because I'm not exempt from anything. I am not exempt from anything. I can be just as much in a place where I can become addicted to something just as anyone else listening or under my voice. And it's a situation where I just want us to be realistic. And I don't want us to cover things up because we feel like it's easier that way. Easy doesn't always mean right. Like I said earlier, self-medicating helps in the moment, but when that moment is over, the problems that were there before you started are still the problems that are there. And I'm not saying that people aren't allowed to drink or, in states where it's legal, because we know that marijuana has been legalized across many states. I'm not saying that you can't engage in the things if you are at an appropriate age and the law says it's okay for you to do those things. I'm not in a place of judgment. Everyone is able to live their own life and to make their own decisions. And I don't want to take that autonomy away from anyone. The only thing that I want to do is to help open the conversation, open the door for something that we have hid from for a very long time. Like, I'm sure there are many of us who grew up with it within our households and paid no attention to it, or maybe we did pay attention to it and decided that we wanted something different for ourselves. But I think in paying attention or not paying attention to these things, we haven't painted the picture for what it is and recognized that we have been dealing with something for so long as a culture, from being discriminated against, from not having the same opportunities, from having poverty, from having lack of education, lack of resources. Just having the world against us in general has put us in a place where we feel like we don't have any other options. And when you're struggling from things like depression and extreme anxiety or PTSD, when you're having flashbacks or nightmares or intrusive thoughts about something traumatic that happened to you, or you're reliving experiences that sometimes it just feels so much better to not be in that moment. And I get that and I understand, but I really want us to grow as a culture and to heal from the things that we can control and heal from, and to replace those habits of addiction. I think that starts, one, with if we are ourselves addicted, which I know sometimes it's hard to admit that. If we ourselves are addicted, or we know someone who is addicted, is stepping up and helping that person see. Now, I'm not saying that you have to take on full responsibility for their treatment or their recovery process, because that's not necessarily your job. But a big part of rehabilitation and becoming sober is support. It's so important to have support for anything in life, but especially addiction. And I know I've talked a lot about addiction as it relates to drugs, but there are so many other things that we can be addicted to. Like, addiction is just not for drugs. Yes, I've talked about drugs because I realize that that's something that's very heavy within our culture. It's normalized. We see people die from it all the time. It's nothing or to see within the rap or hip hop culture of someone who is using substances to get through or putting it in their music, or you hear a report of somebody has passed away because they overdosed. Like, those things are very prominent, but those aren't the only things. And I know they aren't the only things. I feel like, there is addiction to so many other things. You can be addicted to food. You can be addicted to things like social media. You can be addicted to porn. You can be addicted to sex. There are so many other things that you can be addicted to. Addiction only means that you've created a habit. Like, that's essentially what it means, is you have now become dependent on this thing. It's become a part of your daily routine. You can't live without it. You use it to function. You use it to get through life. That's what addiction is. And when I was thinking about this episode, I was talking to someone who really felt like porn was a huge thing that plagues our community too. And I don't have all the facts on that, but the porn industry is a huge industry. It is a huge industry. Everyone listening has probably seen porn in some shape or form, whether you wanted to watch it, whether you were exposed to it, whatever the case is. It is something that we struggle with. And I think that we struggle primarily because the culture has made sex such a huge thing. Sex is a requirement for relationships, and we make it a thing to be good and well knowledgeable at sex. And sometimes that means watching porn to figure it out. And sometimes that means now you have established a dependency on watching porn to, what's the word I'm looking for? Not substitute, but using it to get to a point where you're getting a need met. That's what I'm trying to say. You're getting a need met by watching that. But sometimes that also paints unrealistic pictures of what's going to happen within the world, within your sexual experiences. And I know I'm going like from one subject to the next, but I don't want anybody to feel targeted or feel like I'm only focusing on one thing. But I just wanted to point out that there are other things that we can become addicted to. But I know when it comes to addiction, we really have to, like I said earlier, figure out ways to rehabilitate ourselves and rehabilitate our cultures. First, one, addiction is a disease. Addiction is a huge part of mental health. Those things can be one and the same. And we need more programs that are aimed at mental health awareness and addiction literacy, which is why I'm talking about it now on my podcast, one. Two, why I even have a podcast around mental health, because I realize within our community, we don't talk about mental health as much. We are biased when it comes to mental health. We consider mental health to be a thing that we can pray away at times. And mental health can be such a taboo subject that we don't focus on it. So we definitely have to have more programs within our community. And for those of us who have the knowledge and have the awareness, to begin advocating for those things and recognizing how it affects our culture so that we can paint a different narrative. We don't have to adopt the narrative that Nixon created during the war on drugs. Yes, that was something that happened in that time. And yes, it's something that has plagued our culture ever since. But that does not have to be what we decide that we continue on within this world. We don't have to do that. It's not something that I think we should. And I think many people listening feel that way as well. And I think also, or definitely not, I know these are like facts, these are recommendations, but we need greater access and more access to addiction treatment and mental health care. There is such a disparity and such a gap in access for the best solution for addiction crisis in minority communities. And when it's nothing for a person of another race to struggle with addiction and for them to have and be afforded the best care when it comes to rehabilitation. But unfortunately, we don't have those same things. And I think sometimes as well, we don't believe in the treatment that is afforded to us. And so we don't do that. But there are research is key. We have the internet. We are in the world of the internet. We can look up different treatment centers, different opportunities. I'll even say this. If you're listening to this and you feel like you need resources or you don't know what those resources are, you can definitely reach out to me. You can always email me. And I would be more than glad to help find those things, because I do have more of a knowledge because I'm within the mental health field and I've worked with, children and adults who have suffered from addiction. And I recognize it's a hard thing, one, to admit, and two, to seek treatment for, because you don't want to be judged. And I know a lot of the times when people come out and they admit that they are suffering from addiction, there's so much judgment that comes with that from other people, rather than understanding and compassion and love and empathy for that person to be strong enough to admit that that's something that they're struggling with. And it's not our job, it's not our duty to judge people or to make people feel like they're not in a place where they can get help or ask for help or admit that something is going on that they're having a hard time dealing with. That's what I'm trying to say. And like I told y'all earlier, I'm very passionate. So y'all probably heard me stutter a lot or not being able to search or find my words when I'm talking about this, because this is something that I've struggled, not myself, but I've seen people around me struggle with. I've known people to die from addiction, and it's just so heartbreaking, because I know that there's so much more for us. I know that we're more than the things that we become victim to. I know that, and I know that we can be so much stronger as a community, so much stronger as a culture. I know that we can help each other more than what we are doing. I know that we can be more compassionate or more understanding. I think education is power, knowledge is power. And the more that we have these conversations, the more that we become aware, the more that we know what addiction is, what addiction looks like, the more that we can do. We can't ignore addiction and act like it's not something that's happening for us. It's something that's happening. It just is. And we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that. And I want it to start here for me. I try to be very understanding and very compassionate, but I know sometimes I also fall short. I know sometimes if it's someone close to me, my emotions come into play, and I want so much so to help them that sometimes that help probably seems like judgment, and probably seems like I don't trust them to be able to do it on their own. But it's not the case, and it's a struggle. And I hope I'm making sense. I hope I'm not all over the place. This is such a hard topic to talk about, but I did want to throw out some facts of what addiction typically looks like. And so I do realize that for every person is different. Everybody's experience is different. But for the most part, addiction is what addiction is. So some people, or people who suffer from addiction, will have intense cravings. They'll have a physical dependence on it, which means if you aren't using it, your body will go through withdrawals. You'll have symptoms related to that. You may have body aches, stomach aches, fatigue, sweating. you probably didn't experience these things before, but because your body has become dependent on it, those things have now become a part of your biology. As I said earlier, you'll also develop a tolerance. So whereas before it may have taken a certain amount to either get drunk or high, it becomes more and more that you have to start taking in to actually feel something from it. And that's why sometimes they say like certain things are a gateway drug, because it'll start there, but then it'll require more to fulfill that original high that you had, which is always what our body is trying to do. You may engage in increasingly risky behaviors. So things like engaging in criminal activity, not protecting yourself during sex, things like this are risky behaviors. Also drug-seeking behaviors. So doing whatever you can to get that fix. Also may experience financial trouble because your money has now gone towards aiding the cravings that you're having and making sure that you can get that high. You may neglect your responsibilities. I want to share an experience for me. When I was in grad school, I had to go to 5 different self-help meetings, 12-step program meetings. So one of the 2 that I went to was Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And y'all, those were 2 of the most eye-opening meetings that I have ever been to. There were tears, not just from the people talking, but from me and the people in the room, because there were so many things that happened within their life after they became addicted to drugs, and different decisions that were made that essentially took away from who they were, what they were able to do, how they were able to live up to their responsibilities and to the fulfillments of the people around them, their families, their friends, their jobs. All of those things suffered as a result. And sometimes you may also develop unhealthy relationships with other people who support addiction. So if you are trying to rehabilitate yourself or to work on becoming sober, but you're still around people who engage in those behaviors and engage in certain activities that you used to when you were using drugs, it'll become harder for you to resist that and to stay sober and to go into relapse, because the environment does not promote what you're trying to do. And then you might also have isolating behaviors, because a lot of the times when you are suffering or people are suffering from addiction, they feel like no one understands. They feel like sometimes the drugs are all they have, or they're all they have. And sometimes it'll also cause you to engage in certain ways that you don't want other people to see that. So it's better off to be by yourself, better off to isolate yourself. You're not disappointing anyone. You're not neglecting responsibilities, or at least feel like you're not neglecting responsibilities. So those are some, signs and symptoms to know. But at least in North Carolina, we have managed care organizations for each county where you can gain access to what the resources are. And if you look up managed care organization within your area, it should bring up, I know Durham is Alliance. That's also Wake County. I know that counties more towards the north, so like Vance County, Henderson, Granville County, those places. Cardinal is their managed care organization. There's also East Point, which I think is more so like Rocky Mount. Greensboro, I believe, has become Sand Hills. Those are all different managed care organizations. And I'm sorry for those of you who don't live in North Carolina, but for wherever you live, wherever your state, looking those up and seeing what resources are. There are 12-step programs everywhere across the world that you can get access to, because a big part of rehabilitation and becoming sober from, drug and alcohol use is to being able to have supportive people who understand, people who have lived experience, having a sponsor, which always has had lived experience of some sort. And then also going to therapy and getting treatment. So treatment to, wean your body off is one thing. Treatment to address the psychological part of addiction is something different. So that's something that goes into rehabilitation as well. So those are all the things that I just wanted to throw out there. Of course, if I think of something else later, I'll try to get it out to you guys in some way. But I really just wanted to talk about addiction today because I know we don't talk about it. I know we have normalized it. I know we have made it a part of the culture. And I don't want us to self-medicate anymore. I want us to have a good time. I want us to enjoy and live life. But I want us to use healthier ways to manage day-to-day life. I get it. Life is hard. Life is stressful. There are so many days where I'm just like, if one more thing happens, like it's just too much. Like, just give me a break. And I understand that it can be a hard thing when that's your normal all the time. And I really want you guys to look deep within your village of support, your tribe, the people who are there for you, and see who you can trust to be in a place where if no one knows that you're struggling from addiction, that you can talk to them and say, hey, this is what I'm going through. And if you're the person on the other side listening, I need you to be understanding. It's going to be a hit. It's going to hurt. And you're going to have so many feelings and so many thoughts, and you're going to want to help that person so much. But the biggest help that you can do is to listen and to give them that one person who they feel like understands. And also recognize that sometimes, you're not going to get it the first time. You may, rehabilitate yourself or become sober and then relapse, because that's also a thing. And it also is something of addiction. And that's why treatment is so important. That's why therapy is so important. That's why support is so important. That's why having other activities is so important. Having coping mechanisms other than what you've become addicted to is so important. But let's change the narrative, y'all. This doesn't have to be us anymore, and I don't want it to be us anymore. And I hope I made sense today. I feel listening right now, I feel like I was all over the place, but I also felt like maybe there was a message in there somewhere. And I appreciate y'all for listening. I appreciate y'all for tuning in. I appreciate y'all for entrusting me with being able to talk about these things and just being open to at least listen, if nothing else. I just want to plant seeds. That's it. Even if those seeds don't bloom today, I planted them. It may happen tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, 10 years from now. But the seed is planted. And now it's up to us as a culture to decide what we're going to do with those seeds. That's all I can say. I think I'm at a loss for words now, which is very uncommon. But I love y'all, and we're all in this together. We're going to beat addiction. We're going to beat self-medication. We're going to become healthier as a culture. We're going to cope healthier as a culture. Hence, cope for the culture, y'all. So, as always, thank you for tuning in. I am your host, Tiana Renee, the Culture's Advocate, and I appreciate y'all so much. Bye, y'all. For more information about the show, events, or if you have any questions, you can find us on Instagram at Healthy Pleasures Inc. and visit us at www.healthypleasuresinc.org.